Okay, so it's a real pleasure to introduce David Pattie, who is a reader in drama and theatre studies at the University of Birmingham,
Yes.
not Chester anymore. He's the author of The Complete Critical Guide to Samuel Beckett and numerous other books on topics such as Kraftwerk and popular music. And he's currently editing a book on the Velvet Underground, which I'm really looking forward to. He's writing a monograph on the theatre of David Hare, and he's also writing another monograph on popular music performance as drama.
Yes. Gigs as last pieces of theatre.
Brilliant. And he's going to talk to us today about the Beckett soundscape.
Thanks, Ulrika. And I'd also like, as everybody has, to extend my grateful thanks to Luz and to Gunnery and to the team here. First of all, for the invite, and secondly, for the support during the day. Just before I begin, first of all, I have a persistent cough, which I shall try to keep to a minimum during this, because I know how annoying it gets. The second thing is, and this is more of an apology to the people doing the simultaneous translation, I am from Scotland, so therefore I struggle with English as much as anybody else in this room. So I do apologize. This paper is basically a chance for two of my research worlds, Beckett and popular music, to come into collision. And it's very much offered not as a finished argument, but as the beginning of an exploration into the technologies of Beckett's theatre, into the ways in which those technologies create environments that the protagonists and also that the audience, in this case, inhabit. And I'd like to start off with what is, I think, one of my favourite passages in Malloy. And I really do wish that Connor was here to actually speak it for us. It's a moment when Malloy becomes aware, finds himself listening, not to the sounds of the confused world that surrounds him, but to another world placed ambiguously somewhere away from him. I listen, and the voices of a world collapsing endlessly, a frozen world under a faint, untroubled sky, enough to see by, yes, and frozen too. And I hear it murmur that all wilts and yields as if loaded down. But here there are no loads, and the ground too unfit for loads and delight too, down towards an end, it seems can never come. Now, sounds like this occur throughout Beckett's work. Thinks of Vladimir and Estragon, talking so they don't hear the sound of all the dead voices that surround them, or Ham, driven to distraction by the sound of a dripping in his head, the threens and the choruses that Watt hears on his way to Knott's house. Malloy's iteration of this eternal Beckettian state is notable, however, not simply for the elegance of the language in which it is expressed, but also for the link he makes between the sound he hears and the world the sound suggests. The link is immediate and apparently unmediated. The sound doesn't suggest the image, the sound is the image. The voice Malloy hears automatically locates itself and him in a new space. Malloy has only to listen and he is transported. Now, Timothy Morton, in an article called Earworms in the Fall-Winter 2016 edition of the journal Soundscape, argues that sound, any sound, is inherently unstable and relational. Here's a quote. A sound is self-contradictory, weird entity, just like DNA, a physical structure that is also a semiotic one in the right kind of environment. A sound talks about the physical entities that made the sound, and yet it doesn't talk about them. This is fundamentally because a sound is always a collision between one plus n plus an infinite number of things. We don't hear the sound itself. We don't hear the wind in itself. We hear the wind in the trees. We hear the wind in the doorway. The sound we hear is a story about trees and about wind. In other words, all sounds act on us in the way that Malloy's voice acts on him. A sound suggests a source suggests a location suggests a world, and because a sound suggests but does not exactly reflect the conditions of its production, it is especially prone to a peculiarly individual semiosis. It carries meanings that only reveal themselves to the individual listener, meanings that are not inherent in the sound itself. Now, I play guitar, and I know that when I pluck a guitar in a certain way, with a plectrum and I half mute the string with my finger while I pluck it, I can create a peculiarly pinched tone that's very, very rich in harmonics. Now, a listener who's schooled in the codes of Western popular music can listen to that and can hear emotional strain in it, can hear generations of blues musicians who use the same technique to give emotional articulation to the solos that they play. This tradition, the blues tradition, has a location, and it's easy to imagine the world that such guitarists might occupy. The clubs they would play, their stellar dress, even down to that peculiar, excited, eyes-closed facial expression that guitarists always seem to pull when they make that particular noise. But the sound itself is just the result of a technical trick. It's the manipulation of a wire pulled taut over pickups and resonating in accordance with the interacting properties of the metal, the magnetic field, and the wooden body of the guitar. But the sound makes a space, because the sound is a collision between a variety of complex forces, and the sound in the space makes a meaning that exists only at the point of perception. So Malloy and Watts and Vladimir and Estragon and all the various protagonists in Beckett's fiction and theatre exist in, if you like, two worlds. We have the material world, experienced as a series of more or less baffling objects and structures, and as a constant, nagging, painful intrusion on the integrity of the self. And then there's a sound world, less easy to fix, composed of voices, music, noises that are suggestive of new physical locations that can only be intuited rather than fully understood. Sometimes these worlds intrude upon each other, as they do in Krapp's last monologue. Sometimes the listener tries to evade this world, this sound world, or to efface it entirely, if you think of A Joe War, That Time, for example. But in all these cases, the protagonist is subject to the pull of an extra-diegetic reality, located in a space, created through the careful placement of sound, either as a carefully described element within Beckett's prose, or as an invisible but located element within the mise en scène of Beckett's theatre, film, and TV work. And I'm going to delve into that in a bit more depth in the rest of the paper. Now, I want to return momentarily to Malloy listening to his decaying world. The sounds accessible to him create the reality in which he finds himself for as long as he listens to them. The voices also recreate him. For that moment, he is the sole person to have access to the frozen world and the faint, untroubled sky. He is subject, in other words, to a phenomenon described and theorized by the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, and employed in, amongst other places, some contemporary theorizations of sound. For Merleau-Ponty, when the thinking body perceives, it is itself transformed in the act of perception. To perceive is to be born into a new world shaped in exactly that moment of perception. As the contemporary sound philosopher Vigeland, in Listening to Noise and Silence Towards a Philosophy of Sound Art, published in 2014, puts it, every sensory interaction pushes back to us not the objects, phenomenon perceived, but the object or phenomenon filtered, shaped and produced by the sense employed in its perception. At the same time, this sense outlines and fills the perceiving body, which in its perception shapes and produces its sensory self. This is a gloss on Merleau-Ponty's famous, "The perceiving body is an incarnated body." Malloy is this in the quote given above. The perception of a sound leads directly, with no discernible pause, to a world different from the world in the rest of the novel. This world has its own dynamic, its own duration, its own unique atmosphere, and all of these phenomenal features incarnate themselves for Malloy at the moment of perception. But it also does something else, something that's rather more Bergsonian. It creates a moment in which the thing perceived outruns the process of perception itself. The world Malloy intuits from the sound he hears runs on and on and on, endlessly, to an end point he can't begin to imagine. And in Beckett's prose, then, sound incarnates a world, or at the very least, signals the intrusion of another world into the perception of the central character and the reader. Company, for example, relies on the protagonist's ability to listen to, and in doing so, to inhabit the worlds that his voices describe. The repeated ping in ping marks the intrusion of another reality, another modality, in all its various ways undefined, into the apparently sealed box in which an undifferentiated figure crouches. In each case, sound creates a disturbance in, or a refocusing and expansion of, the world of the listener. But in Beckett's theatre and television work, sound operates differently. And that's what I'm going to go on to discuss in the rest of the paper. I'm going to say that in Beckett's theatre and film work, TV work, the operation of sound allows the thing perceived to outrun the process of perception. It extends the world of Beckettian performance into territory that cannot be fully described or accounted for. And Merleau-Ponty is a useful guide in this area as well. In his posthumously published unfinished work, The Visible and the Invisible, Merleau-Ponty describes a famous moment in Swan in Love, the narrative that forms roughly half of the first volume of Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu. Swan, visiting the salon of the social climbing Vaudoraz, hears a phrase from a violin sonata played on their piano. This is a quote from the novel itself. A year before at the soirée, he'd heard a piece of music performed on the piano and violin. At first, he'd experienced only the physical quality of the sounds secreted by the instruments, and it had been a keen pleasure when below the little line of the violin, slender, unyielding, compact and commanding, he had seen the mass of the piano's part all at once struggling to rise in a liquid swell, multiform, undivided, smooth and colliding like the purple tumult of the waves when the moonlight charms them and lowers their pitch by half a tone. Swan's perception of the world created by the sound of the instruments is paradoxical, as Merleau-Ponty points out. It is simultaneously directly present and hard to grasp. It signals a world that Swan could begin to see, but in the moment that it is perceived, it slips beyond his perception. As Merleau-Ponty argues, the little phrase, it's a quote, "The notion of the light are not exhausted by the manifestations any more than is an idea of the intelligence. They could not be given to us as ideas except in a carnal experience. Every time we want to get at it directly, or lay hands on it, or circumscribe it, or see it unveiled, we do in fact feel that the attempt is misconceived, that it retreats in the measure that we approach." Now, this isn't to say that what is perceived will stay entirely beyond our grasp. Rather, the very act of perception reconfigures the relation between perceiver, the thing perceived, and the means through which the sound is created. Quote, "At the moment one says light, at the moment the musicians reach the little phrase, there is no lacuna in me. What I live is as substantial, as explicit, as a positive thought can be, even more so. A positive thought is what it is, but precisely is only what it is, and accordingly cannot hold us. Already the mind's volubility takes it elsewhere. We do not possess the musical or sensible ideas, precisely because they are negativity or absence circumscribed. They possess us. What we are possessed by is the reality opened up by the configuration of sounds within a space. What we become in the moment of perception is a perceiving body passing through two spaces, the tangible physical space we occupy, and the virtual space opened up in sound. One space is bounded and physically present, one space is numinous, unfixed, impossible to capture, because the mind no sooner perceives it than the mind changes and the space changes. Now, I'd like to propose this double perception as a way of thinking about how sound operates in Beckett's theatre, and I'd like to do so by blending it with another concept, and this one is drawn from the study of popular music. The idea of a soundbox as a sonic environment created by music has been employed by various theorists in popular music, notably by Alan Moore, who is probably the preeminent theorist of popular music writing in English. But I want to take a particular way of thinking of a sound box, which essentially is that sense that you get when you listen to music, that the music is creating a space and an environment for you. I want to take a particular way of looking at that oral phenomenon. And this is drawn from the work of a chap called Leo, and this is terrible, I never know how to pronounce his second name. And I can see him looking at me funny as I insult him by saying that I think his second name is pronounced Camilleri. This is from an article called Shaping Sounds, Shaping Spaces, and you can find it in Popular Music, volume 29, edition 2. What Camilleri argues about the way that sound works in space in recorded music is that you can think of the sound as occupying 3 spaces simultaneously. One of them he calls a local space, one of them he calls a spectral space, one of them he calls a morphological space. And I'll talk you through each one of those in turn. Very simply, with the aid of this microphone. The local space is exactly where the sounds are. So in this room, at this moment, the local space consists of what you can hear of my actual voice producing the sound here, what is coming through that speaker, and also what is coming from, and I'm again sorry that I'm involving the translators within the unfolding of the paper, but the local space is also determined by the sound coming from the back of the room. Even though you're facing me, you are aware of the scale of the space because you can hear a voice behind you. A spectral space is the space that sound suggests. And I do apologize to you, I played a trick on you when I read that Proust quote. I manipulated the spectral space. I went from the normal distance that my mouth is from the microphone into close miking, which changes the space, makes my voice, because it is more apparent to you and because you can hear the way in which my voice is being created, you can actually hear the workings of my larynx at this point, which is unpleasant for you, and I'm really sorry about that. This connotes intimacy. This draws us together, changes the space. So that is spectral space, the space the sound suggests. Morphological space is the sound's duration in time. And for the last time, I shall involve the translators. One of the ways in which morphological space works here is that there is a delay between the sound that I produce and the sound the translators produce. The difference between those sounds creates a sense of duration within the space. So local space, where the sounds are; spectral space, the space the sound suggests; morphological space, the duration of the sounds. And Beckett, in both TV and in his theatre work, manipulates spectral sound and morphological sound as one of the given techniques of his writing. Just to save time, I'll skip very quickly over what I was going to say about the operation of these spaces within the TV work. And luckily I can do so because yesterday Ulrika gave us a fantastic example in the extract that she played from Ghost Trio of the manipulation of spectral sound within the environment set up within that play. And it happened at the point at which the camera was, one can imagine, in the center of the space, looking at the rectangle of the door. At that point, you could hear the music. When the camera, one can imagine within the space, turns to look at the window, there is no music. Turns to look at the glass, no music. The door occupies a different sonic space, a different implied sonic space, because one sonic element is added to the space occupied by the window, to the space occupied by the glass. The door at that point is marked out as the space in which something significant will happen, something related to the music. And that is created entirely through the manipulation of sound. In the theatre, so that slight moment where you drop the text and you have to recover the text again, but I think I'm back on track. Beckett's work for the theatre also utilizes sounds that create both spectral and morphological space. However, unlike the TV work, these are created in a space that performer and spectators share. Now, in his earlier theatre work, Beckett creates implied soundscapes momentarily that confuse any easy reading of the spectral or morphological spaces the characters inhabit. It's a wonderful example of this in Godot. There's a cry, a very loud cry, that sounds as though it's quite proximate to the stage. But exactly the space denoted by that cry is never quite made clear within the text. We can't easily relate that offstage noise to an implied space which exists beyond the boundary of the performance. And in that much quoted passage that I've already spoken about briefly, in the second act, Vladimir and Estragon talk of all the dead voices that only they can hear. And as he described the sounds, as with Malloy, the audience is asked to imagine both a sound, they make a noise like wings, like leaves, like sand, like leaves, and the implied landscape that these sounds create. But that landscape and the skyscapes are incommensurate. We switch from a sky filled with birds to a forest to a beach and back to a forest in the space of a few lines. We are distanced from the sources of the sounds. We don't find out definitively where that offstage cry comes from, and we hear voices, sounds, telling us about the sound of voices that sound like a landscape we can't fix. These moments position us as spectators in the midst of an unmoored spectral space. Not only do we imagine a location in which these sounds might happen, we perceive them, but we can't hold them in place because they are evanescent. In Merleau-Ponty's terms, they move away from us, and we move away from them. After Godot, the development of Beckett's theatre can be thought of as a deepening investigation of the properties of spectral and morphological space within performance. Voices are displaced in time and describe other voices that are displaced even further from the play's physical staging, as in Krapp's last tape. Voices are placed in specific physical locations on stage, as in play. Voices, sounds, come from the darkness in that time in rockabye and footfall. Voices speak but are unheard in Not I. Voices describe other worlds in Ohio Impromptu and a piece of monologue. In each, the space of the soundscape is greater than the space of performance, but the exact dimension of the space revealed through sound can never be fixed. What has changed, though, is that the soundscape, broadly defined as both the arrangement of sound on stage and the meanings taken from the sounds performed, comes to predominate. The human figure is confined, its power is constrained. It comes to be valued as a machine that produces sound. The figures in play, for example, are both characters with a relation to each other and to the light, and sound-producing machines whose differing tones and rhythms are mixed live in front of the audience. Later, a figure-like speaker in a piece of monologue is essentially an on-stage speaker, like the ones above me. As mechanical as the voice of Bam in What, Where. In fact, it could be said that a figure-like speaker and the offstage voices in Footfall and Rockabye are the incarnation of the voices Malloy hears, the voices that describe for him the image of a world he intuits, but simply can't finally grasp. My final example, That Time, which is a piece whose staging is so fragile that Beckett himself voiced doubts about its viability as theatre, is, if you like, a pure version of the Beckettian performance soundscape. 3 voices, arranged around a central image, one on each side and one above, recount memories that are, the audience might assume, the memories of the old man whose face is illuminated in the center of the stage. But these voices, these sounds, these tones, these rhythms, do not present memories unvarnished. They twist them into the shape of a question, and a question which, when you're listening to it, is hard to grasp. That time you went back, that last time to look, was the ruin still there? Where you head as a child, when was that? Grey Day took the 11 to the end of the line, and on from there, no trams, then all gone long ago. That time you went back to look, was the ruin still there? Where you hid as a child, that last time, not a tram left in the place, only the old rails, when was that? The voice is engaged in a complex moment of temporal displacement. The time of the memory is unfixed, when was that, rather than that was when. And the moment and the sound, describing and performing, is evoked only to be displaced by another memory and another tone and another sound, and by another event that happened in the inguessable past, the monument which fixes in the protagonist's past, the moment when the trams disappeared. A moment is perceived through sound, and at the moment of perception it begins to vanish. The play concludes with all of the memories the voices invoke fading into nothing, and with the old man smiling as the voices lapse into silence. The voices have opened up spaces that are both spectral, but we don't know the extent of the spaces they evoke, and morphological, although the temporal relation of the elements described is always unclear. The spectator, watching and listening to that time, watches an image, but also finds herself experiencing a world through sound, which seems to open up and shrink back in space and in time, over and over. And here in conclusion, we return to Merleau-Ponty, and to the way in which the particular soundscapes of Beckett's theatre works. I'll rephrase that. The way in which the particular soundscape of Beckett's theatre, works. That sounds better. No text describes a fixed past, or the fixed extension of space. Even the tapes in Krapp's last tape are cut into by Krapp, the restless, impatient sound technician. The spectator, then, is in the position of an active perceiver and interpreter of the sonic information that the plays make available. And because, like, as Merleau-Ponty notes, the act of perception is an act which intimately involves the perceiving body, the spectator cannot help but be part of the space created by the sound box of Beckettian performance. The nature of that space, however, remains impossible to grasp. The presentation of sonic information within the space impedes the creation of a secure environment that can be shared between protagonists and spectators. Anna described the late plays this morning and used the phrase closed box to describe them. Closed box describes very, very well the physical relation of elements on stage in Beckett's late theatre. But as the world of Beckett's performance closes around the spectators, visually, sonically, they come to inhabit worlds of infinite, ungraspable space. And as audience members, we are placed within this space, and we are placed within the unfolding structures of the performance created through sound in a way that mirrors exactly the position of Malloy at the beginning of this paper. He said at this time, though, it's not Malloy who's listening, it's us. And what we hear, what is incarnated for us in performance, are the dead or ungraspable or unplaced or unknown voices, talking to us about a world which arises and collapses in the moment of perception. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for a wonderfully evocative paper, very thought-provoking. Now I'd like to invite questions to David. Yeah, Michael. I wonder if you should take...
Thanks. I'll turn into close mic. Just freak everybody out. Well, I just realized as you were talking that I close mic my entire talk, so I apologize for that. David, so I really enjoyed your paper. I wonder if you could. I'm thinking of this sort of through Schopenhauer and the idea of music being incommensurate with space and causality, which Beckett, which is important for Proust actually. The passage that you quote from Merleau-Ponty when Swan starts to put the music together and understand it, he spatializes it in his mind.
Yes.
And that's exactly the moment when the narrator of the novel says that wasn't any longer pure music. And then I think Beckett picks up on that in his writing on Proust. So it's just the idea then that there's something about music or listening that is incommensurate with spatiality and causality. That's, I think, what both Proust and Beckett get from Schopenhauer. So isn't there something, so I'm just questioning then this idea of a space opened up by music. And my to say that, I'm not saying, oh, this isn't working there in Beckett's work, just as it works in Proust's work, that music leads on to space. But I think in Proust, and certainly in Beckett's writing on Proust, the transfer between listening or music and space is exactly a problem and something that they insist upon. So I'm just wondering if the idea of a soundscape, an infinite or ungraspable space invoked by music, is actually something of a catachresis or something like that. You're using not quite the right word, and I'm not saying that that's a problem. I think Beckett and Proust both do that as well. Does that question make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think to answer it, I would say that what happens within Beckett's performance it's not so much that, let's see to phrase this correctly, it's not so much that a soundscape is created, let's say, as a piece of music, or in musical terms. What happens is that the sounds created within performance themselves then create spaces. So it's not, what we're talking about here is not, it's not really music. It's the spatialization of sound. It's the way in which, even let's say within this environment, our sense of the space within the environment is created as much by what we hear and how we hear it, as it is by our awareness of the physical space. I would say in relation to music, and I think that Ghost Trio is an excellent example of this, as are moments like Death and the Maiden coming into All That Fall. What happens is that music does not describe the whole soundscape. Music itself is placed within the soundscape. So in All That Fall, the music helps create a sound world because it is there and then it passes. So the protagonists walk past it. Within, let's say, Ghost Trio, it's not necessarily the space that the music itself creates. It's the music as itself as a spatial element, which is kind of unfixed within the space of performance. So at one point it's audible, but with the camera in an implied position that the previous image has told us should suggest the music is audible. The music is inaudible. At the beginning of the play, we track in quite slowly to the central image, and as we do so, we hear music. At the end of the play, we track back, and the music continues. So the music itself is an unfixed element that we can no longer securely place within the space of performance. So I'm not really thinking about music here. I'm thinking about the way in which instinctively we spatialize sound. We spatialize sound almost without thinking about it. And Beckett's theatre and Beckett's performance work, it does seem to me, plays with that sense that we spatialize sound. And it creates within that sound worlds created in various ways through the voice and what the voice says and the tone and the rhythm of the voice, the placement of the voice and other sonic elements on stage. It places us in the position of, let's say, a person trying to place where the music is in Ghost Trio. We can't fix it. The space that it seems to suggest cannot be defined. It cannot be grasped. It is always at the point either of disappearing or of transforming into something else. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, well, let's talk more about this, because it could be a long conversation.
I think so. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for amazing paper. And it's going to be related to Michael's question. I've always been obsessed personally with the songs in Beckett, especially in Happy Days and in Crabs. The idea of, like, did I ever sing? No. So thinking about, again, because you mentioned your example with the guitar, like you're talking about sounds, and then we go back to voices, because we have voices, we have instrumental music, but we have songs that tend to play this kind of role of, you know, like a swan song. It's like the final, right? Like at the end of Happy Days and so on. So what will that do to your soundscape theory that you're developing here? What is the particularity of the voice singing in relation to sound?
I have a wonderful article for you with a fantastic name written by pop music academic and journalist called Dana Weinstein, and the article, entertainingly, is called "All Singers Are Dicks." It has to do with the position of the front person, the singer within a band, and it describes why the singer is always tends to be thought of not as a musician, but as somebody who bears the trace of their selfhood in the music and in the tones that they create. In Beckett's work, when people sing, it does seem to me that in terms of how the sound is produced, the weight is always thrown back on the state of the vocalist, because nobody in Beckett sings beautifully. Nobody in Beckett sings properly. Nobody in Beckett sings as a craft skill. If you think, let's say, of Vladimir coming in at the beginning of the second act of Godot, coming in, starting, and oh, I can't do that, and finding a way of singing, and then pausing before he goes through the song again. If you think of Crap in something which I think is sometimes excised in Crap's last tape, where he sings, "Now the day is over, night is drawing nigh." And as he gets to the end of the third line, he starts to cough, and the cough overwhelms him and destroys his voice. And Winnie, at the end of Happy Days, singing the Merry Widow Waltz, and again, when that's played, it's generally played as a very, very fragile, almost a very, very kind of tiny performance moment in the midst of a vast space. I think, technically, because for the person performing, it can't be anything else, because the set is here, and that's not a good singing posture to have, and that's not recommended. So the process of singing pushes your attention away from the song sung, pushes your attention away from the music, back to the tonality, to the imprecision, and to the frailty of the individual human voice. And from that, we tend to read the self, which is how vocalists operate generally. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Ferg. Yes. Sorry? Oh, really?
Oh,
No more questions. Could we not have one more? Yeah.
go on. I am already.
Thanks, David. I'll keep it quick then. I'm just interested in, particularly when you were talking about that time, and it's very strange to imagine that stage again, because it's so rarely staged, as you said. But isn't there a sense that when everything is stripped out, everything physical is stripped out, and we have the bare faces? If I understand you correctly, what sound is doing in there, what a vocal sound is doing, is almost filling what a stage always does. But you did say then that actually sound dissolves. So is there a sense that you're reiterating a physicality in the stage that is necessarily going to fall apart anyway, and that this is an easier way of demonstrating that or representing that solvency, rather than in the actual physical, in props, in stage, in set, or anything like that? So that's what he's getting to.
Yes. Yes is the very short answer.
Yeah.
The sounds fill the space, and much in the same way, although to be mixed differently, that the speakers here fill the space. But what they fill the space with is something which, when one tries to make sense of it, is very difficult to catch hold of in the moment of performance. So simultaneously, a performance world expands as the sound fills the space, but the performance world also disintegrates because the meaning that the sound carries cannot be held.
Yeah.
So it's one of you have moments. It's almost as though there's that origami trick of dropping crumpled paper in water and something folds out. A flower folds out. It's almost as though the meaning is dropped in water, the flower folds out, and then at the point at which it folds out, it folds back in again, recrumples itself. So it's simultaneously created and destroyed. And that is created by the way that sound operates within the space. What it means for the world that is presented to us to listen to, and the particularity, the granularity of the actual things that we are listening to. That paradox pulls against itself in an awful lot of Beckett's late work, and creates a sense of a world which, certainly for me, is infinite, but ungraspable.
On that note, I'm sure there are more questions, but I suggest that we continue this discussion elsewhere. I know I have questions to David. I thought this was a wonderful paper. Can we thank David again?